Good day. Today, the two wars that are simultaneously taking place in two of the most contested parts of the world, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza and the Palestinian territories. Both of these wars continue unabated, and of course, following the end of the humanitarian pause, the conflict in Gaza has intensified. I will return to that topic, the conflict in Gaza, later in this program, but I will focus first on the situation in Ukraine. Yesterday was a day of swirling rumours about negotiations with the Russians and between Ukraine and the Russians, rumours about the final capture of Marinka by the Russians, and about the situation on the battlefronts, elsewhere on the battlefronts. I'm going to deal firstly, as I traditionally do, with the situation on the battlefronts. Let us turn first to the topic of the situation in Marinka. Now, yesterday, a video appeared showing Russian soldiers hoisting a flag in Marinka, and in that video, those soldiers apparently said that the entirety of Marinka has fallen under Russian control. A couple of hours later, reports began to appear that, in fact, this claim that the entirety of Marinka has fallen under Russian control is premature. It is said that there are still some Ukrainian holdouts in a few places in the town. And I think the best, perhaps the most accurate summary of what is happening has been provided this time from Rybar. And I will read briefly what Rybar is saying about this. I'm taking it from Rybar's message on X. A few hours ago, the reports of a complete clearing of Marinka. The reason was a video of a Russian flag hoisted above a house on Komsomolskaya Street on the westernmost outskirts of the town. Nevertheless, it is very premature to talk about the capture of Marinka. The enemy, that's the Ukrainians, is still holding positions in the northwest part, and a lot of work still needs to be done to completely destroy the Ukrainian forces in this area. Difficulties for storming operations are the same. The city is now a solid ruin, which is perfectly visible from the air from all sides. The fighting is actually going on from basement to basement. There are no other shelters in the area. This creates difficulties for consolidation on the taken lines. The Ukrainian armed forces, however, have similar problems, with the amendment that as the Russians advance, it will become increasingly difficult for them to supply their pockets of defense in the ruins of Marinka. Now, Marinka is indeed a ruin. I've been seeing pictures over many months of what this small town of around 10,000 people now looks like. It is absolutely flattened. I don't think that there is a single building left standing, at least none that I have seen. It is absolutely a shattered place. And I think what Rybar is saying, that where the Ukrainians continue to resist is in a few basements of a few remaining buildings, is probably true. And I think Rybar's further point that because the city is so shattered, there is little cover for the Russians to use as they advance, so that in effect they have to build fortifications in the ruins with each incremental advance that they make. I think that is also almost certainly true. However, I do suspect that we are now very close to the situation, the final situation, the position where the Russians will be able to finally announce the complete capture of Marinka. It does seem as if a significant part of this town, at least a significant part of the remaining Ukrainian-controlled areas of this town, has indeed been captured by the Russians over the last couple of days. As I said in my program yesterday, a report that I saw some days ago said that the distance the Russians had to cross in order to clear Marinka fully of Ukrainian troops had reduced to 750 meters. And my understanding is that the Russians have now moved along most of that distance of 750 meters. Reba suggests that this is crossing the remaining distance, clearing the remaining Ukrainian holdouts is going to take a little time, and is challenging. But I suspect that, as he also says, the difficulty of keeping these pockets of defense supplied for the Ukrainians are now becoming insuperable. And I suspect that over the next couple of hours, we will hear that the Ukrainians have finally given up in Marinka and are retreating from the village. There's a report about the fighting in Marinka, interestingly enough, in The Guardian today. And it too appears to hint at a likely Ukrainian withdrawal. Now, the reason I'm going to The Guardian in discussing the situation in Marinka is, of course, because The Guardian is a fiercely pro-Ukrainian media organization, and it tends to draw its conclusions mostly from what the Ukrainians, especially the Ukrainian General Staff, is saying. Though, as we will see, it does touch also on Reba's report. But anyway, this is what The Guardian says. Control over Marinka, a town in eastern Ukraine, all but destroyed by more than a year of fighting, remained uncertain on Friday, with unofficial reports suggesting Russian forces had registered some gains. Reuters reports that most accounts of Marinka, southwest of the Russian-held regional center of Donetsk, describe it as a ghost town amid daily reports of Ukrainian forces defending districts. Once home to 10,000 people, there are no civilians left. Ukraine's General Staff said in its evening report that Russian forces had been unsuccessful in attempts to advance on villages near Marinka, but did not mention troop movements in the town. And that is significant because when the Ukrainian General Staff is emitting reports about the town itself, it starts talking about villages close to it, that tells us that the situation in the town is becoming difficult, is going wrong for the Ukrainians. And then The Guardian goes on to say Russia's defense ministry made no mention of the town in its dispatches. And this is true, and I will shortly later in this program discuss the latest report we've had from the Russian Defense Ministry. And it does refer to Marinka, but it doesn't refer to Marinka as having been fully captured. And then we have the reference in the Guardian report to Reba. The unofficial Russian blogger Reba referred to a photo circulating on social media showing Russian forces hoisting the national flag in the southwest of the town. And then Ukrainian forces, presumably that's Riba, remained in control of other districts. And then there's a further report, and this is unclear to me where it comes from, but it might be from Riba. If information about the movement of Russian troops to the south is accurate, the enemy's retreat is a question that is fast approaching. And then we learn that Ukrainian social media accounts noted Russian advances, but quoted soldiers as rejecting the notion that Moscow's troops controlled the entire town. So, if you put all this together, it seems to me that one can see why I've reached my own view. I think that Marinka, this battle for Marinka, is now almost at an end. The Russians clearly have made significant advances in Marinka. The silence about this from the Ukrainian General Staff strongly suggests that. We see that Ukrainian social media accounts effectively concede that this is indeed the case, and it seems that there's just a few holdouts left, and presumably at some point over the next couple of days, week or so, who knows, the remainder of Marinka will be cleared, and this town of 10,000 people will fall finally and conclusively under Russian control. This has been a long, protracted, and very difficult battle. As I remember, the Russians actually, at least not the Russian Defense Ministry, but unofficially, various Russian social media accounts and claims by the Donetsk regional government last year in October were claiming that Marinka had been captured by the Russians. Then, a whole year later, there's still Ukrainian holdouts there. The Russians have found capturing Marinka extremely difficult. I get the impression that in the spring, a decision was made to finally bring Marinka fully under Russian control. I recall that at the time, Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, said that he'd received a personal order from Putin to send his troops, the Chechen troops, to Marinka to finally clear Marinka of the Ukrainians. And then what happened shortly after is that Ukraine mounted its counterattack in the Bakhmut area, and the Chechen troops who were briefly deployed to Marinka were redeployed to the Bakhmut area, where they were tasked with defending positions in the Klishevka area, southwest of Bakhmut itself. And then, of course, the Chechen troops had to be pulled back from Bakhmut in June to deal with Prigozhin's mutiny, and then they were sent back to Bakhmut again, but in total they were never apparently deployed in Marinka for any length of time. And then the Ukrainian counteroffensive began, and the Russians had to deal with that. And now, finally, after this complex, protracted, stop, go sort of approach, it looks as if we're finally close to the point where Marinka itself is about to be finally captured by the Russians. Now, saying all of this, I ought to say that there's been some claims in Russian media, on Telegram channels, that Marinka supposedly has lost its strategic importance, that the Ukrainians, recognizing that Marinka was about to fall, were creating defense lines further west, around various villages further to the west. I'm sure that that is true. I'm sure that there are further Ukrainian defense lines to the west, but I still think that the capture of Marinka is going to be of significance. This is, after all, a town formerly of 10,000 people. It may not be a ruin, but nonetheless, it was a ruin that the Ukrainians were able successfully to defend for a very long time, holding up Russian advances in the area. And I suspect that any hurriedly created stopgap defences further to the west are not, in small villages, are not going to be a substitute for the defence lines that were created in Marinka itself. Moreover, I've heard a multiplicity of reports from various sources that Marinka, Avdeyevka, Vuhledar altogether made up the base of the Ukrainian defences in south-western Donetsk region, and that if Marinka fell, that would ultimately and potentially compromise Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar, and of course with Avdeyevka also likely to fall soon, and we'll come to Avdeyevka shortly. It seems to me that this entire defense system that the Ukrainians have created in south-central Donetsk region is starting to break down. Lastly, there is the psychological effect, which must never be underestimated. Marinka and Avdeyevka are two towns close to Donetsk city, very close to Donetsk city. One could even perhaps, at a stretch, refer to them as suburbs of Donetsk city. Holding Avdeyevka and Marinka kept the Ukrainians close to Donetsk city. They were places from which the Ukrainians, between 2014 and the start of the special military operation in February 2022, it was the fact that the Ukrainians were holding these two towns, Avdeyevka and Marinka, meant that the Ukrainians were able to claim that they were close to Donetsk city, that they were keeping Donetsk in effect under siege, that they might eventually be able to advance on these two towns into Donetsk itself. And of course, especially in the case of Avdeyevka, it was important. Control of Avdeyevka was important in enabling the Ukrainians to continue their regular shelling of Donetsk city, keeping the citizens of Donetsk city consistently in a position where they would have felt themselves to be under siege. So the loss first of Marinka and then of Avdeyevka, which I'm sure is coming, is going to be a psychological blow. It will mean that Ukraine's troops have been pushed further back away from Donetsk city itself, and that the prospect of Ukraine ever recovering Donetsk city has in effect melted away, and that there is no realistic prospect that the Ukrainians will ever be able to return there. And I think that will be a difficult blow for some Ukrainians to accept, perhaps President Zelensky inclusive. Now, that's the situation in Marinka, to the best of my understanding. What about Avdeyevka, which is this other place to the north, where fighting is also going on? Now, there were lots of reports yesterday of the Russians continuing to push deeper into the Avdeyevka control zone from the south and the southeast, pushing towards the district of Khimik, which is defended, by the way, as I understand it, by the 53rd Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, which was the brigade that recently quarreled with the 110th Brigade, which is defending Avdeyevka itself, further to the southeast. But perhaps the biggest drama in and around Avdeyevka is taking place to the north and to the northwest, with the Russians continuing to push hard towards the two villages of Stepnoye and Verdychi. Now, I should say that I've probably identified this village of Stepnoye. I've called it by various different names at various times. It is very difficult, I should say, for me to read sometimes unfamiliar words, and if I've got its name wrong on occasions, well, I do apologize. But anyway, yesterday there were reports that the Russians were in full, rather the day before yesterday, there were reports that the Russians are in full control of Stepnoye. Then Slavyangrad published a map which showed the Russians in partial control of Stepnoye. The military summary channel, which 2 days ago was reporting that the Ukrainians were evacuating Stepnoye, yesterday reported Ukrainian counterattacks on Russian positions in and around Stepnoye. My overall impression then, again, about this area is that the Ukrainians are making desperate attempts to try to prevent the Russians from consolidating control of Stepnoye and pushing further west towards the next village of Verdychi. So there is clearly intense fighting going on. The Ukrainian unit that is defending in this area is, by the way, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the brigade that was equipped with the Bradleys and the Leopard 2 tanks. It seems that some elements of this brigade have been moved deeper into the Avdeyevka SOC, this area that constitutes the Avdeyevka defense zone, if you like. They've been moved to try to also defend some of the areas like the coke plant, the chemical factory, closer, in other words, to Avdeyevka itself. But the major battle, the major fight that this brigade is involved in, is that it's desperately trying to hold the line around Stepnoye and Verdychi. And my guess is that, well, they're able to slow the Russians. They can't ultimately prevent Russian advances in this area from continuing, and that the Russians steadily are making progress, that there is fierce fighting, that there are encounter battles, that the fighting sometimes swings backwards and forwards, that the Russians sometimes occupy parts of Stepnoye, sometimes they capture all of Stepnoye, the Ukrainians immediately counterattack, the 47th Brigade immediately counterattacks. It's sometimes able to push the Russians back, sometimes it's has been succeeded in driving the Russians entirely out of Stepnoye. But eventually, the sheer accumulation of Russian forces in this area, and apparently the density of Russian electronic warfare capabilities in this area also will begin to tell, and that eventually the Russians will indeed be able not just to consolidate fully control of Stepnoye, but push on to Berditschi too. And again, going back to that article from El País, which I've referenced many times in many programs, the article in El País, which I discussed about 2 weeks ago, is a Ukrainian soldier from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade, and he conceded if the Russians are able to consolidate control of the railway track, and he didn't actually mention these two villages, but also capture Stepnoye and perhaps Berditschi too, and are able to push their armor beyond the railway track in sufficient quantities and cut the remaining roads, then Avdeyevka, the fate of Avdeyevka is sealed. So that gives us a sense of the importance of this particular battle. In the meantime, as I said, it's important to reiterate that fighting within Avdeyevka itself remains intense. Both the 53rd Brigade, the Ukrainian 53rd Brigade near Khimik, and the 110th Brigade, which is defending Avdeyevka itself, are coming in for are under intense pressure and appear to be gradually retreating from various positions that they have held. So, a difficult situation for Ukraine in Avdeyevka, but obviously an intense battle going on. And of course, if the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka hear news over the next couple of weeks or days that Marinka has fallen, then of course that will have presumably an effect on their morale. Though I would have thought that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry will try, to the extent that it can, to keep bad news from the rest of the battlefronts away from the soldiers on the ground. Anyway, let's now turn to what the Russian Defense Ministry has been saying, because as they now regularly do, late on Fridays, the Russian Defense Ministry provides an interesting overview of the state of the fighting over the previous 7 days, from the 25th of November to the 2nd of December, in other words, until today. And there's some interesting points that it makes, and it says, for example, that in the Kupiansk direction, units of the Zapad group of forces have improved the situation along the front line near Sinkovka and repelled 18 Ukrainian attacks. Now, there have been lots of reports that the Russians have now captured the northern part of Sinkovka. This report from the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't exactly confirm that, but it does suggest it, and I suspect that it is true. We've seen that the Ukrainians have mounted relentless, continuous attacks to try to dislodge the Russians from these positions that they've gained in Sinkovka, this village close to Kupiansk, which many people see as the gateway to Kupiansk. There have been no fewer than 18 attacks, counterattacks, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. All of those counterattacks, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, have been unsuccessful. The important point is that the Russians, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, have improved the situation along the front line near Sinkovka, which suggests that the Russian Defense Ministry, which is extremely conservative in its reporting of territorial gains, now takes the view that the territory that's been captured near Sinkovka, presumably the north of Sinkovka, is now fully consolidated under Russian control. In which case, if that is correct, then presumably before long, the rest of Sinkovka will be captured as well, and the main battle for Kupiansk will finally start. Elsewhere, incidentally, the Defense Ministry does talk about the situation and all the various towns and villages that we've spoken about are specifically referenced. So it again confirms the capture of Khromovo. It says that in the Donetsk direction, units of the Yug group of forces, that's the South group of forces, supported by aviation and artillery, continue to improve the tactical position at the forward lines and liberated Artyomovskoye. And Artyomovskoye, as I've discussed on many occasions, is the same village that the Ukrainians call Khromovo. But then it goes on to say, for example, this is the Russian Defense Ministry, that in addition, strikes were delivered at Ukrainian manpower and hardware near Marinka, Kurdyumovka, and Klashayevka. So these are the two references to Marinka and Klashayevka in this report. This came out last night, I should say, late last night. Note that neither Marinka nor Klashayevka are referred to in the report, in this report from the Russian Defense Ministry, as liberated, in other words, captured, but along with Kurdyumovka, which the Russians have always held, and from which it seems they're counterattacking, they are referenced in this interesting way in the same paragraph. And I'm going to speculate here, it's my guess, but then why shouldn't I engage in a little speculation, that this particular paragraph is perhaps intended to prepare us for the possibility, the probability, that within the next couple of days, the Russian Defense Ministry is going to announce that Marinka and Klashayevka have both been, well, captured in the case of the first, recaptured in the case of the second. Notice also, well, the Russian Defense Ministry also says that over the past week, 25 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces were repelled by the Yug group of forces. It's not clear where these attacks are taking place. Marinka is located some distance away from the Bakhmut area. Marinka and the Bakhmut area appear to be lumped together, which is interesting. But anyway, these 25 attacks have taken place, and that again suggests intense fighting in the Bakhmut area and perhaps in Marinka as well. But what I'm going to do now is do something which I've done before and discuss what the Russians say about the casualties that the Ukrainians have suffered over the course of the last week. And let me reiterate once again that I'm not saying that these casualty figures that the Russians give are necessarily accurate to the precise number. The Russians have said, or Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has said in the past that the Russians gained their casualty estimates from radio intercepts, reports, in other words, by Ukrainian commanders to their superiors, which suggests that these reports may be true. And what we know about the general state of the fighting and the level of casualties that Ukraine is suffering overall, all of that does suggest that these Russian reports are probably roughly true, but that's not my purpose in discussing them here. My purpose in discussing them here is that the Russian Defense Ministry is giving us, through its estimates of Ukrainian losses in the various parts of the battlefronts, an idea, a good idea, of where the fighting on the battlefronts is most intense. And we discover that in the Kupiansk area, over the course of the last week, the Ukrainians lost, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, 315 troops in the Krasny Liman area. This is the area where the fighting is perhaps closest to the Oskol River. The Ukrainians lost 950 troops. Now, I haven't been discussing very much the fighting around Liman, around the Oskol River line, but we can see that according to the Russian Defense Ministry, it's a lot more intense. It's been a lot more intense than the fighting close to Kupiansk. 950 Ukrainian troops lost near Krasny Liman and in the area of the Oskol River, as opposed to 315 lost near Kupiansk. And then we have figures, and I suspect that these are combined totals, for the fighting in Marinka and Bakhmut, and possibly Avdeyevka itself. I should say that Avdeyevka is not mentioned by name anywhere in these Russian intelligence defense ministry bulletins. They give you no clue that there is a major battle going on in and around Avdeyevka itself, and all of these villages that I've been talking about, Stepnoye, Berdichi, I haven't seen them mentioned in Russian Defense Ministry reports. And that's an interesting fact, and it gives a sense of the nature of these reports and the care the Russian Defense Ministry takes in the way it doles out information. But anyway, in this area, in the Bakhmut area, in perhaps Marinka, conceivably Avdeyevka also, the Russian Defense Ministry says that the enemy losses amounted to more than 1,680 troops, 6 tanks, 6 armoured fighting vehicles, 31 motor vehicles, and 19 field guns. So what that tells us, and I'm going to say straight away, is that by far the most intense fighting over the course of this week is taking place in central Donetsk, in the area of Bakhmut, Avdeyevka perhaps, and conceivably Marinka as well. This is the main focus of the battle. Now, there's also been fighting in the Vremivka salient, and here the Russian Defense Ministry says that the Ukrainians have lost 880 troops, and if we go to Kherson region, where the Ukrainians are still trying to clinging on to clinging on to their small bridgehead. The Russians claim that Ukraine has lost 450 troops, so significantly less than in central Donetsk, Donbass, but up to 13 field artillery guns, 23 boats, and 26 motor vehicles. And at the same time, in Zaporozhye region, the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, the focus for so long of Ukraine's offensive, losses there amounted to 315 troops, Ukrainian troops, again according to the Russians. So you can see that the main battle now is very much in central Donetsk. It's in the Bakhmut, Marinka, perhaps Avdeyevka area, though, as I said, the Russian Defense Ministry tells us nothing at all about what is going on in and around Avdeyevka. It is not providing us with any clues as to the progress of the battle. But one can see that the losses, the Ukrainian losses there, are extremely high. At a rough estimate, something like 40% of the total Ukrainian losses claimed by the Russian Defense Ministry across the entire area of the battlefield. So that's what I wanted to say about the state of the war so far. Now, the other thing that's been happening is that there are more and more reports, swirling reports now, of a deepening political crisis in Kiev, of pressure for negotiations, and according to an extraordinary report by Seymour Hersh on Substack, a claim based on the usual anonymous US source that General Zaluzhny, the overall commander of Ukraine's armed forces, and General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, and the overall commander of the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine in the area of the special military operation, that Zaluzhny and Gerasimov are negotiating directly with each other in order to end the war. And the suggestion that Seymour Hersh is making, the claim that Seymour Hersh is making based on this report from this anonymous source, is that both sides have made dramatic, in fact astonishing, on the part of the Russians, concessions to the other. The Ukrainians, Zaluzhny, has apparently accepted that the Russians will retain complete control of Crimea, but that there will be some kind of elections in the four regions, and the assumption presumably is that the four regions will choose to side with Russia. On the part of the Russians, remarkably, we're told that Gerasimov has advised Putin that it is impossible for Russia to win a decisive victory over Ukraine, and that the war is indeed therefore in a stalemate, and therefore in order to end the war, the Russians are prepared to agree that Ukraine should join NATO, minus Crimea and possibly the four regions, but should give an undertaking that NATO troops, foreign troops from the other NATO countries, should not be based on Ukrainian territory. What are we to make of this incredible report? I'm going to say straight away that I don't believe it. I am sure that it is wrong. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. First of all, not just I, but as every single report from the battlefields by people who are well informed about the progress of the war confirms, the war is not in stalemate. The Russians are in fact advancing steadily and incrementally and grinding the Ukrainians down. And I find it all but inconceivable, given what we're hearing about the state of the Ukrainian military, that it is short of manpower, that it is short of equipment, that Gerasimov would give as his professional opinion to Vladimir Putin a report that the war in Ukraine has therefore become unwinnable, and that he would actually try to sell to Putin a proposal that any part of Ukraine should become part of NATO. That makes no sense to me at all. The second thing I wanted to say is that if negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians were indeed to take place, I think it is all but inconceivable. In fact, I think it is entirely inconceivable that these negotiations would be conducted between Zaluzhny and Gerasimov. I think the Russians, if they were presented with a proposal from Zaluzhny for negotiations, I think the Russian political leadership would immediately reject it. They would say that Zaluzhny is in no position to conduct negotiations. He does not represent the Ukrainian government. If he wants to discuss with the Russians terms for surrender of his military units along the lines of General Lee in his negotiations with General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. I discussed all of that in another program. Well, that is another matter. But the Russians will say to Zaluzhny that, Zaluzhny, you are not a proper and fit person for us to discuss political matters. You are a military officer in command of the Ukrainian military. You are not, or at least you are not yet, in any political position, and you cannot therefore bind the Ukrainian government or indeed the collective West. I also believe, as a matter of record, and this is something that Putin has talked about at extraordinary length, that the Russians would never believe any kind of undertaking given either by Zaluzhny on behalf of Ukraine, or indeed by the Ukrainian government on behalf of Ukraine, or indeed by NATO, that NATO troops would not enter and establish bases in Ukraine. There have been, by the way, similar promises made by NATO in the past. I remember and recall clearly that back in the 1990s, the early 1990s, there were all sorts of commitments by the Western powers that the NATO would not establish permanent military bases on the territory of the former Warsaw Pact. And of course, when the countries of the former Warsaw Pact joined NATO, well, eventually, inexorably, unavoidably, they did so. So I think that the terms that is being referenced here are all but inconceivable as well. And I would also quickly, again, add that if negotiations were to take place, any sort of negotiations were to take place between the Ukrainians and the Russians, it is all but inconceivable that they would be conducted by General Gerasimov, who is not a diplomat or a political figure, but who is the chief of the general staff. Let me say that I think that whoever is providing this information to Seymour Hersh probably does not understand the nature of the relationship of the Russian military to the political leadership, the general staff and the uniformed military to the Russian leadership, and is not aware of the thinking and opinions of senior Russian military officers. If you want to get the best sense of what the thinking of the Russian general staff is, well, the best person to go to about this, in my opinion, is John Helmer at Dancing with Bears. He has discussed the Russian military in many, many articles over many, many years in his extensive reporting about Russia. Other people you might want to go to, Andrei Martyanov, who, of course, served within the Soviet military and therefore has some knowledge of the system from the inside, and Jim Kinnair, who's written books about the Russian military procurement process, both Soviet and post-Soviet, and has had contacts with people like Sergei Shoigu. I don't think they've met, but anyway, Shoigu wrote a preface to one of his books. If you go there, you will find accounts of the Russian military, of the general staff. As I said, Helmer has discussed this extensively, and you will know that it is all but inconceivable that the Russian government would conduct negotiations on these kind of matters in the way that Seymour Hersh, or rather more precisely Seymour Hersh's source, is describing. So, given that this story isn't true, and before I leave that topic, let me say that we've actually had a statement about negotiations from no less a person than Sergei Lavrov, and this is a report that appeared on TASS yesterday. Lavrov, who has been attending the meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Lavrov is reported by the TASS news agency as saying the following: so far, we haven't seen any sign from Kiev or its sponsors of their willingness to look for some kind of a political solution. If you listen to what NATO and EU officials say, it all boils to one thing: we must support Ukraine, because if Ukraine suffers a defeat, it will mean a defeat for the entire West. Just like in the tango, it takes two to start the diplomatic process, but the guys on the other side aren't doing the tango, they are breakdancing, and that's a solo performance. Typical Lavrov, by the way, very different from what we're hearing reading from Seymour Hersh. It seems that if negotiations like the ones that Seymour Hersh in his article is talking about, if negotiations like that are taking place, then Lavrov, who is not just Russia's foreign minister, but a member of Russia's Security Council, doesn't know about them, which, to be frank, I think is inconceivable. So what is this all about? Well, there are a number of possibilities. One is that this source is simply wrong and is making it all up. That happens. Or is perhaps passing on information to Hersh, which is essentially gossip rather than fact. As I said, that happens too. Or it could be, and this is a very real possibility, that whoever is providing this information to Hersh is actually trying to use Hersh to create trouble between Putin and Gerasimov. Putin himself will presumably know that he has given no authority to Gerasimov to conduct negotiations of this sort, and presumably the hope or expectation is that if someone passes this article up to Putin, and it has been mentioned in the Russian media, then Putin will become concerned and will want to know why Gerasimov is talking in this way to Zaluzhny and making these sweeping concessions to Zaluzhny. And that might be, as I said, a ploy by someone in the US intelligence community to create trouble between Gerasimov and Zaluzhny. I think that's certainly a possibility, by the way. The third possibility is that somebody is out there trying to make trouble for Zaluzhny himself. Anyway, who knows? But this does all bring us back to this other subject. There are lots of talks, lots of discussions about secret negotiations, tensions within Kiev, increasing tensions within Kiev between Zelensky and his officials. Zelensky and Zaluzhny are at odds with each other. Well, that's been widely accepted. And there's also now circulating a really very remarkable video. I don't know to what extent it is true and to what degree one should place any reliance upon it. But anyway, there is a video circulating, or rather not a video, a recording circulating, of an alleged conversation between the former Ukrainian President Poroshenko, and the Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, in which Poroshenko seems to be discussing some kind of coup attempt against Zelensky. That's the only way I can interpret the discussion, and seems to be attempting to win over Akhmetov to the side of the coup plotters. And Akhmetov, for the record, doesn't seem to be entirely convinced that this is any sort of good idea at all. I know nothing about the provenance of this recording. I'm extremely wary about placing any weight upon it. The fact, however, that it is circulating shows that someone appears to have gone to some trouble either to record this conversation and to publish it, if it's a real conversation, or to fabricate it and to publish it in a way that seems to be intended to deepen the sense of crisis within Ukraine. And there are other reports of other people becoming increasingly antagonistic, that there are increasing criticisms of Zelensky himself, but also, I should say, criticisms of Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian MP that I have talked about in the past. She seems to be active. Again, she's also apparently making all kinds of criticisms of Zaluzhny. And interestingly enough, her name is Mariana Bezuglaya, incidentally. She has drawn specific attention to the fact that in that meeting that took place, and which I discussed yesterday, the one in which Zelensky confirmed that Ukraine is now moving to the defensive, that they're going to try to build great fortified lines to hold back the Russians. Bezuglaya made the point that Zaluzhny was not present at that meeting. Now, that, I think, is about the only thing one could say for a fact. That, as I said, there does still seem to be an ongoing campaign to discredit Zaluzhny underway and to marginalize him from discussions and to basically make it appear that he's no longer in the key decision maker in Kiev that he was. That, however, it must be said, is a Ukrainian campaign. Yesterday, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, General Brown, had a telephone conversation with Zaluzhny in which they're supposed to have discussed the situation on the battlefronts. And I wonder whether the purpose of that call was not so much to discuss the situation on the battlefronts and what the actual situation on the battlefronts really is, but perhaps instead to signal continued US support for Zaluzhny, and that the US does not want to see Zaluzhny dismissed at the present time. As always, the reports are very terse. The Pentagon simply says that the two military leaders discussed the latest battlefield assessments. Anyway, just saying. So, a lot of maneuvering going on in Kiev, but again, to repeat for the record, I think this report about talks between Zaluzhny and Gerasimov is certainly wrong. I think this is one instance when Hersh has certainly been fed incorrect information. I'm not going to speculate further on the motives, the intentions behind that, but I'm sure that discussions of this nature are not in fact taking place. As a matter of fact, there's been a whole raft of further statements from Russian officials which appear to be taking a very strong line about the progress of the war. And I noticed that Medvedev himself, Dmitry Medvedev, has again been speaking openly about these matters, and he's now apparently on record as saying that the Russian military, that the number of people who joined the Russian military this year up to this point has now reached 450,000, which, if true, if that is correct, is greater than the total number, which is 420,000, that the Russians were planning for at the start of the year. By the way, Putin has just signed a decree that increases the size of the Russian armed forces. It says that the staffing level of the armed forces of the Russian Federation will now stand at 2,209,130. But note, however, that the actual number of people who will be in uniform is 1,320,000. It'll be 1,320,000 military personnel, which I presume means active duty personnel. So, for the record, I think that the fact that the Russians are building up their forces in the way that I've discussed in many programs effectively challenges this assumption that they expect the war to end soon. I think they will continue their grinding operations for the next couple of months. I suspect that some big blow will probably fall sometime next year in 2024 as Russian officials and Russian military commanders like Alaudinov has said, I don't see the situation on the battlegrounds as being in any way in stalemate. And finally, I think this report from Hersh on this occasion is certainly wrong. Anyway, that's my assessment of the situation on the battlefronts. Deepening political problems in Kiev, rumours swirling around Zaluzhny and his long-term position, signs that the Americans are apparently trying to back him in this conflict that he's now in with Zelensky, but realities on the battlefield continuing to move steadily against Ukraine. The Russians continuing to make progress in Marinka, in Bakhmut, as I've discussed in recent programs, and in Avdeyevka as well, and perhaps in Kupiansk too. Anyway, let's move on to that other conflict, the one in the Middle East. And after 7 days, and I touched on this yesterday, the ceasefire, the humanitarian pause in Gaza has ended. The Israelis have now resumed their bombing campaign in Gaza. Secretary Blinken has again ineffectively tried to persuade the Israelis to moderate the nature of their offensive in Gaza, but the Israeli government has apparently chosen to disregard whatever advice or pressure they're coming under from the United States, without perhaps a straightforward demand from the United States that the military operation in Gaza be brought to a stop. I suspect that we're going to see much more of this stop-go operation taking place. And this morning, the Financial Times was again saying that the Israelis expect a long war in Gaza, that they expect the fighting to continue there for many months, perhaps a year. And they're now going to try to extend the fighting into southern Gaza as well. And of course, the bombing of Gaza has resumed. Now, I want to reiterate again, I do not think that this is sustainable. We've had a 7-day humanitarian pause. This is already causing dismay amongst some US government officials, apparently, that the fighting in Gaza has resumed, especially in the way that it has done. It's causing increasing problems in Britain as well, by the way. I noticed that the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who has tried to align the Labour Party in support of the Biden administration's policies in Gaza, has now finally said that he wants a cessation of fighting in Gaza. He still avoids use of the word ceasefire, but apparently the pressure within the Labour Party has intensified to the level that he is finding himself obliged to talk about a cessation of hostilities. I think it's only a question of time, with the bombing once again underway, that a full demands for a ceasefire will intensify, certainly in Britain and in the United States and internationally as well. And perhaps a further sign of the pressure is the fact that even people like Jonathan Freedland, Guardian journalist, with whom I disagree on almost every conceivable topic, and who is generally very, very sympathetic to Israel, is grasping the problems. Now, he was recently in Israel, and he said that he spoke whilst there with a senior figure on the country's right, in other words, one suspects someone within the government, who privately confessed his fear that Israel's offensive had barely degraded Hamas as a fighting force. He estimated that Israel had killed perhaps 5,000 Hamas men, whose deaths, incidentally, this is Freeland's point, should be counted in that 15,000 figure. These are the 15,000 people who have been killed over the course of the fighting in Gaza. I'm not sure that's correct, by the way. But anyway, that's another story. And then this apparently senior figure says that would leave a Hamas military wing still numbering between 20 and 35,000 men. And in the opinions of this person, this is someone on the right, we don't know who it is, the survival of even a fraction of that number, along with a few leaders, would be cast by Hamas as a symbolic victory. Yet, if the past 7 days are any guide, how many more Gazan deaths would it take even to reach that point? And that's from Jonathan Friedland. And he goes on to say, if the only way to defeat Hamas is to bomb civilian areas, because that's where Hamas operates, then this could be one of those goals that slips further out of reach the more you pursue it. Because loss of civilian life serves as a recruiting sergeant for Hamas, sowing hatred in the hearts of the bereaved. And then Jonathan Friedland discusses a rather moving episode in the life of his own family, which I don't think it's appropriate for me to touch on in this program. But one could see that apparently even some of Prime Minister Netanyahu's supporters are conveying their concern that Hamas has perhaps been dented by this military operation, the one we've seen up to now, but it is far from destroyed, and that trying to continue this operation for weeks, months, in order to destroy Hamas is an unachievable objective, because like a hydra, the more people you kill, the more people will feel angry, Palestinians will feel angry and motivated to join Hamas, and ultimately, in some ways, the stronger politically, and conceivably in the end even militarily, Hamas eventually will become. And apparently there are some doubts within the government about that. But of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu's position makes it all but impossible for him to back off. He was pressured by the Americans into agreeing a humanitarian pause. That humanitarian pause was originally going to be for 4 days. Well, the initial suggestion was it would be for 5 days. Then it was reduced to 4. Then it was increased to a possible 10. Then it was brought to an end after 7. But the reality is that as soon as the fighting resumes, the political pressure starts to grow again. Now, I appreciate that there are going to be some people who think that this is all going to become routine, that people are going to lose interest in all of this. My own sense is that this is actually not the case. I get the sense that pretty much everywhere across Europe, certainly in Britain, the pressure, on the contrary, to bring this conflict in Gaza to an end is intensifying, and that far from that pressure slackening, the more likely outcome of prolonging the war is that when the fighting is eventually brought to a stop, almost certainly following a UN resolution, probably a Security Council resolution, the outcome will also be that that resolution starts to make political demands on the United States and on Israel itself for mechanisms to be created for a final political settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which of course are not the ones that the current Israeli government or any conceivable future Israeli government would want to see. In other words, the longer the war is prolonged, the more disadvantageous for the current political leadership in Israel the outcome is likely to be. And that is the trap that was set on the 7th of October. Of course, for President Biden, there's the other problem, which is it's probably going to erode his prospects in the election next year. But, I'm not going to devote time in this program to discussing that. The more important point is that for the moment at least, the longer the conflict goes on, more important perhaps, is that the fighting goes on in Gaza, the more likely it becomes that the eventual political resolution of the fighting in Gaza will be such as will open the way to a political process, a diplomatic process, for an eventual end to the entire conflict, which will not be according to the current Israeli government's desires. There we are. They took the decision to take the bait, to move into the trap. I understand why. I understand the motivations. I've said many times that decisions made in anger and still more in fear are decisions that generally end badly. And anyway, that I remain convinced will be the outcome. So I will no doubt return to this topic more over the next few days as the diplomatic pressure resumes, as I am certain shortly it will. Thank you for joining me again for this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can check out our shop, find there all the amazing things that we have there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.